I'm Kelly Jennings, CEO of Powerband Solutions. Powerband is a cloud-based provider of auction, inventory, and finance solutions that make buying, selling, and financing vehicles more efficient. Powerband Solutions trades on the TSX Venture Exchange symbol PBX and on the OTCQB symbol PWWPF and on Frankfurt symbol 1ZV. For more information, please visit us at powerbandsolutions.com.
You're listening to HowStreet.com radio, available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. Welcome to HowStreet.com radio, the online source for market opinions. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is John Rubino, author of several books on the economy, including The Money Bubble, his website, dollarcollapse.com. Welcome back to the show, John.
Hey, Jim.
Well, the stock market, pretty bumpy now, volatile. Is this a step down, a correction to the markets, or are we still going to see something like a Black Monday or a Black Friday?
Well, this is pretty close to what happened in 2006, 2007, when everything was going great and stocks were at really high levels, and then instead of continuing to go up, it got choppy. There would be huge up days and then two huge down days, and it just went on like that with these really big numbers. You know, if it wasn't a 300-point day on the Dow in the U.S., it felt like unchanged. You know, it felt like there was no action at all. And then everything fell apart. So we got choppy and then crashed. So we've got the choppy part right now, and we'll see if the crash follows. But it could be that, well, psychologically that makes sense, because you've got to shake people out of complacency before they panic. And extreme volatility will do that, because when you've got a stock portfolio that, is down big as it is again today, you stop thinking that buying the dip is a wise move after a while, and you start thinking that selling the rip is a good move. In other words, when something goes up, you take some profits. And then that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and everybody sells, and then everybody panics, and then that's your bear market. So we're in the early stages of something that feels like that. We'll see if it continues that way, but it's definitely got people's attention. The Federal Reserve, for instance, just in the last week sent out 2 regional bank governors to say that, hey, maybe, it's time to stop raising interest rates. Maybe we're at neutral, which is their target interest rate, the point at which it's not too high and not too low. And they're starting to say that that's where we are, therefore we don't need to raise rates anymore. And they're hoping that that will calm the markets down. We'll see. It may or may not. We can't know until after the fact. But if that doesn't work, if it stays choppy or starts to fall from here, then they'll have to do something else, which the next step would be at December's Federal Reserve meeting, they don't raise interest rates, even though everyone expects them to. And they see what the markets think of that. If the stock market stops falling and starts going back up, then their job is done. But if it keeps falling, or things stay choppy, or other things in the world happen that are scary, then the next thing they've got to do is cut interest rates. And the thing after that, if that doesn't work, they've got to go back to quantitative easing, where they start buying assets with newly created currency and try to pump up the banking system that way. So the pattern of 2006, 2007, 2008 is repeating through the first couple of stages. And the next few stages are financial turmoil and government response to that. And we'll see how it plays out, but history doesn't repeat perfectly. But this has the feel of the early stages of that previous crisis. And because of that, it definitely bears watching, because the next couple of stages, if they play out the same way as they did last time, are hair-raising. Absolutely terrifying.
We'll have more with John Rubino right after this.
Avon Resources Limited is a gold exploration company with significant projects in British Columbia, Saskatchewan, and the Yukon. Trading on the TSX Venture Exchange, symbol ABN, and the pink symbol ABN-AF. Surrounded by world-class gold deposits and mines, Avon's 23,000 hectares Forest Kerr Gold Project is located in the heart of the Golden Triangle in northwestern BC. For more information, visit us at avonresources.com.
Grand Portage Resources recently completed the 2018 drill program on its 100% controlled Herbert Gold Discovery property located in the prolific Juneau Belt in southeast Alaska. Drill results are expected through late 2018. Past drill results included numerous multi-ounce gold assays on multiple veins. Grand Portage trading symbols are GPG on the TSX Venture, GPTRF on the OTCQB, and GPB on Frankfurt. For more information, please visit our website, grandportage.com.
Welcome back. We're speaking with John Rubino. John, one of my frequent interviews I do every Friday is with Bob Hoy, a market historian, and he says since the Federal Reserve was invented, and it was invented to prevent recessions and depressions, we've had 19 recessions or depressions, so obviously somebody's not watching the numbers, or, as Albert Einstein said, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. Are they insane? Do they actually follow the numbers, or do they have a feeling, yes, we can prevent the next recession?
They're captured by a flawed theory, which is that government can act as a moderator on the normal volatility of capitalism. And actually, it's exactly the opposite. Government exacerbates the fluctuations in markets by encouraging people to borrow too much money, and by keeping interest rates too low, and by moving capital into uses where it shouldn't go, and just generally screwing up the system. We did have a lot of volatility back before the central or the Federal Reserve was created, and there were even depressions back then, but they were like 1-year depressions. There was a depression, I think it was 1904. But don't quote me on that. It was right around there. There was a horrendous depression, just a huge market crash, but we don't hear about that now, right? Because it was over in a year. And in a capitalist system that isn't, quote-unquote, moderated by government and central banks, you get quick, sharp corrections that flush out the malinvestment, get rid of the bad debt, and allow the system to move on. The reason why the Great Depression happened when it did was because we'd already created a central bank that allowed the government to try to stop the 1929 market crash from turning into something really serious. And in in practice, they ended up creating the Great Depression. And ever since, the central bank has intervened in downturns, and maybe made the downturns a little less severe, but stretched out their length, but caused the subsequent boom to be much bigger and much more serious, so that each cycle gets more extreme. The last one was almost a near-death experience for the global financial system. This subsequent boom has been even bigger and more outrageous. They call it the everything bubble now, because every financial asset class just about is wildly overvalued, because the central bank cut interest rates to unnaturally low levels, and that caused everybody to borrow money, and that money had to go somewhere, so it went into financial assets. So we've got this gigantic bubble now that can be traced back to the action of our central bank. In other words, if the central bank wasn't here, we wouldn't be in this situation. We wouldn't have this kind of debt. We wouldn't be looking at, a crisis for the ages. This is going to be bigger than anything in our lifetimes when this thing finally blows up. And it's going to be the fault of Alan Greenspan and Ben Bernanke and Janet Yellen and the other members of the Federal Reserve Board who voted to bail out everybody in sight and to privatize profits but socialize losses, and generally send the message to the big banks and the other players in global capitalism that you can take any risk you want to and keep the profits, and if it doesn't work out, the government bails you out. So with that kind of a message, it should be no surprise that we've blown up asset bubbles all over the world, and when they burst, they will be just immense. There will be no hiding from them. The only solution will be some kind of a massive currency devaluation, which is the end result of giving governments an unlimited printing press. So we're getting what you would absolutely expect that we would get given human nature, from giving governments an unlimited monetary printing press. So here we are. Nothing we can do about it. All we can do is ride it out and try to own assets that will do well in that kind of an environment and get rid of assets that won't do well.
Is it in bad times when the economy fails and people are feeling hardship that they start electing and encouraging hardline leaders because they think a hardline leader is the only way out?
Well, when you're traumatized and panicked, you tend to want somebody to just fix it. And you don't worry so much about the niceties. You know, is it constitutional? Is it fair? Is it kind or compassionate? You don't care about any of that. You just want the bleeding to stop. And so, yeah, we tend to pick strong leaders who will get the job done when we're at our most worried, most anxious. You know, Germany had a hyperinflation in the 1920s, and they got Hitler not long after that. France had a hyperinflation in the late 1700s, and they got Napoleon. And the list goes on of troubled countries that end up electing and or allowing really aggressive people to come to power.
Well, the current examples would be the new president of Brazil and the current president of the Philippines. Go on, go out and just kill drug dealers. They're the problem. We heavily encourage it. And in the meantime, innocent people get shot as well.
Sure. You can put Donald Trump in that category, too. He comes off as somebody who's just going to get things done. Don't worry about the details. I will fix this for you. And so he appealed to a lot of people who saw their lives being destroyed by globalization and excessive immigration and horrendous monetary policy, et cetera, et cetera. You know, our current big systems weren't working for people. So they were willing to take a chance on somebody who identified the problems and claimed to have solutions. So yeah, you get populism, basically, which is a philosophy that says there are a handful of people at the very top of society who are ripping off the rest of us. Put me in power, and I will go after those guys, and I'll get back what they've stolen from you. And you can be populist from the left, like Bernie Sanders, or populist from the right, like Donald Trump and the guy in Brazil and the guy in the Philippines that you named. But it's the same impulse among voters. You know, they're asking for somebody to save them, and they're not worrying about the details of how they get saved. So yeah, that's what happens. You know, the Italian government is an example of that too. They didn't really have a policy when they got elected. Their policy was to oppose the European Union and the Eurozone and austerity. And they didn't have an actual set of positive policy planks in their platform beyond that. But that was enough to get them elected because people, you know, had reached the point where that was their main focus. They want to stop what the European Union is doing to them. They want to get rid of austerity. And if somebody's willing to do that, they'll vote for them. So yeah, that's how it goes in hard times. And you just have to hope that the hard times are temporary and people come to their senses and we go back to governments that are willing to live within the bounds of the Constitution, wherever we are. You know, right now, and really it's been the last 20 or 30 years, the government just ignores the Constitution in the U.S. We do things that are blatantly unconstitutional, like our surveillance state, where we spy on pretty much everybody, even though it used to be that you needed a search warrant to spy on any individual. Now we do it in bulk. We just vacuum up everybody's phone numbers and listen in on anything we want to listen in on, you know, and read your web search history, et cetera, you know, and that's unconstitutional, but we get away with it because the circumstances are seen to be so dramatic and so dire that we just have to let the government do that. Same thing on the economic side of the spectrum. You know, the U.S. Constitution defines money as gold and silver, but long ago we decided, you know, we're going to just put that off to the side and let the government print paper that's not backed by any kind of precious metal, any kind of monetary metal. And we get the financial crises that we have now. You know, it's no surprise that going to a pure fiat currency leads to too much currency in circulation, which leads to too much debt, which leads to gigantic financial crises. That's just exactly what you would expect. So we're reaping what we've sown here. And we have to hope that we come out the other end with a little bit of sanity still intact. But there's no guarantee. You know, the good guys don't always win historically. And, you know, we need to be there and ready for the argument when it actually matters, to try to bring back limited government with free individuals and a constitution that's respected. But the odds of that happening based on history are fairly slim at this point.
When has a good guy won an election? Truly.
Well,
can you think? Jimmy Carter, maybe?
You know, I would put most of our presidents in the category of relatively benign. You know, even somebody like Nixon, you know, he was a creepy guy, but he didn't stray too far beyond the bounds of the Constitution, except for that one thing where he, you know, his people broke into the Democratic Party's headquarters, and he tried to cover it up. But, you know, by and large,
Nixon brought in the most social justice legislation of any president in U.S. history. Nobody points that out.
Well, you know, coming from the left, there are a lot of reasons to like Nixon. Of course, nobody on the left does like Nixon, but because he was, you know, he was a would-be dictator, except he couldn't really achieve it under the structure of the government at that time. But yeah, he did a lot of things, like he founded the Environmental Protection Agency, and you know, did some things that that people on the left in the U.S. consider landmark achievements. However, anyhow, I started out by saying that Nixon wasn't as bad as it could be. You know, and the same thing with George W. Bush, same thing with Bill Clinton. You know, and anybody who rises through the ranks of a major country political system has to be somewhat corrupt and has to be somewhat flawed. You just can't get there without the level of narcissism that gets you up every day,
and you have to make backroom deals to get the money and the support to get there. So sometimes even if you have good intentions, you end up with some ugly people you have to please.
Right. And even Barack Obama, who comes off as the classiest, most rock solid guy. He came up through the Chicago political system, which is one of the most corrupt machines that have ever existed. So you know that in his background are a lot of shady deals. And he's at least a partially corrupt person because of his environment, because of what he had to survive in to get where he got. But anyhow, that is kind of par for the course in a more or less healthy system. You know, your leaders are going to be complex people with quite a bit of darkness in their personalities and in their backgrounds. But the guys that you elect in times of extreme financial and geopolitical crisis can frequently be a whole different animal. You know, in the Great Depression, we got pretty lucky because we elected FDR, and I know he did a lot of things that absolutely appall the libertarians in the U.S. and they appall me too. You know, as kind of sort of a libertarian, I hate that he made gold ownership illegal. You know, that was just such a power play. That was just a horrendous thing to do. But he was not a would-be dictator. You know, he stayed within the bounds of the Constitution more or less most of the time, and we came out of whatever it was, 15 or 20 years of FDR's time in office in reasonably good shape. We got through hard times, and it was okay. Historically, that's not that common. You know, a lot of the time you end up in a really, really difficult, really stressful situation and hand power over to somebody who's not, you know, who isn't slightly corrupt but mostly good, but who is slightly good but mostly corrupt. You know, that's who you end up with. And that's really dangerous. So we need to be really careful in our elections here, which we're not in the U.S. You know, we're kind of throwing votes almost randomly at people now on both the right and the left who are borderline crazy. But that's just how it goes. The middle kind of shrivels in times like this, and the extremes are where you get votes if you're a politician. So you see Bernie Sanders running as an avowed socialist, and you see that works. So if you're trying to decide what your philosophy is, that becomes an option. Or you see Trump running as a would-be Mussolini almost, and being really mean and calling people names and just doing away with the former niceties of politics. And you see that works. So you don't filter yourself anymore. You just say whatever comes into your head, and you have a pretty good chance of being elected. So that's what the world turns into when a country has screwed up its finances the way we have, because things don't work anymore and people start looking for new solutions. Those solutions tend to be out on the fringes because the middle is what is the conventional wisdom, and that doesn't work anymore. So, yeah.
And also, don't leaders or countries turn to war to take the people's minds off their hard economic times? The Falklands War, Argentina was in a horrible financial crisis. So all of a sudden they fire up their people saying the British stole the Falklands from us, the Los Valinos Islands or whatever they called them. And they had a war over a place that basically raised sheep.
Yeah.
And hundreds or thousands of people are killed. And at the end, of course, the Brits won because their military is 10 times bigger than Argentina's. But in the end, what did it solve? Argentina still had financial problems. They don't go away.
Well, they made a calculation down there. That's an interesting subject, the Falklands War, because, they were a military dictatorship, and that's illegitimate, and it's hard to manage, and they were having problems, keeping their populace under control. And they looked at Britain and saw a country with a woman in charge. And so these Latin guys decided that they could push Margaret Thatcher around, and a lot of her cabinet could be pushed around. They wanted to bail. It was kind of a replay of World War II with Winston Churchill, where everybody else around him wanted to cut a deal with Hitler, and he's the only one who said no. Well, she was kind of almost the only one in the cabinet who said no. We're not going to let those guys get away with it. And she saw it as kind of a gift, a political gift, because it gave her a chance to be strong. And so the Argentine dictators, the generals, ended up miscalculating because they had a woman in Britain who really needed a chance to show that she could stand up to men. And she did it. And, that was one of the things that launched Margaret Thatcher's 10-year career as prime minister. She was, after Churchill, probably the most important prime minister in Britain in the 20th century. And a big part of it was the Falklands War.
Yeah. And I think the Argentinians forgot. Britain, with the help of Canada and Australia and New Zealand, held off the Germans for years without any help. They're pretty tough people. We'll talk Brexit when we return right after this.
Hi, I'm Douglas Mason, President and CEO of Magnum Gold Corp, MGI and the TSX Venture Exchange. A 2015 drill program on the LH property intersected several high-grade gold intersections, including 11 meters of 20.66 grams per ton gold. Additional drill targets on the LH property have been identified by a 2018 drone airborne magnetic survey to further evaluate a pyrrhotite-enriched gold-bearing system. Please visit our website at magnumgoldcorp.com.
Don't miss out. Stay informed. Receive the HowStreet.com weekly recap with thought-provoking podcasts, radio, and articles delivered to your inbox. Sign up for the HowStreet.com weekly recap on our homepage at HowStreet.com.
Welcome back. We're speaking with John Rubino. John, Brexit is not turning out to be an easy thing. Theresa May staking her political career on it, with cabinet ministers resigning, so even inside her government, they're not happy with the agreement. They say they can get a better deal, but I think it's a lot like NAFTA too. The U.S., Canada, and Mexico all agree that they didn't all get exactly what they wanted, but it was the best deal they could get. Is Brexit the same thing? This is the best you're going to get?
Boy, I don't know. Brexit turned out to be way harder to do than it originally looked like it was going to be, because after how long has it been that Britain has been part of the EU? It's been
20 years,
right? Yeah, and in that time they've become really intertwined. There are all these legal connections, and companies in one country operating under rules that won't apply anymore if Britain leaves Brexit, and people living in different countries who no longer have the same status, and borders, like the Irish border thing is kind of funny when you think about it, but also a serious sticking point, because if Ireland stays part of the EU, then how do you deal with the border there? Do you have free movement of people between Ireland and England, which you have had historically, right? But you can't do that if anybody from the EU can go to Ireland and then walk right into Britain, or sail right into Britain, whatever it is you do to get across that little body of water there. And it just goes on and on, apparently. There are a million legal things that have to be separated out and dealt with. And, Theresa May is hanging on by her fingernails. The right wing of the Conservative Party would like to replace her with somebody who's going to be more hardline, but really isn't sure that hardline is going to work with the EU. The EU can't let Britain leave painlessly, because then that opens the door to anybody who wants to leave, who, can just get frustrated and just take off. If it's painless, Italy will do it, or maybe Greece will do it, or maybe Portugal, who knows, and that really lessens the power of the EU leadership. They can't bully these little countries if the little countries can just pick up and leave. So it has to be painful for Britain, and it has to be expensive. But of course Britain doesn't want it to be painful and expensive. They just want to be able to leave, and it isn't even clear now at this really late date in this process that it's going to happen, because they seem to have negotiated something that is an actual Brexit agreement, but not everybody's willing to sign off on it. And so we'll see, if Theresa May makes it through the year as Prime Minister. I don't know. We'll find out pretty soon, but I think the process is going to continue to be messy for a while longer, and that's tough financially for Great Britain, because there's so much uncertainty, and capitalism doesn't work well with uncertainty. Who's going to build an office building in London City or a factory in Manchester, not knowing whether those things are going to be able to sell their products to EU countries on favorable terms? So the pound is really falling lately, and there's no reason to think that it stabilizes anytime soon unless they get a fairly favorable deal. So we'll see. It's still up in the air and still messy, but Europe in general is messy. So there's no reason to expect this particular part of the European project to be smooth, because Italy's not smooth, and Spain is still a mess, and Greece has never recovered from its original depression a decade ago. And Germany's economy is slowing, and France is borrowing too much money, and everybody has way too much unfunded liabilities attaching to their healthcare programs and their retirement plans. So Europe is a mess, and even without, if Brexit didn't exist, Europe would still be a mess. And even if Italy didn't exist, Europe would still be a mess. So I think wherever you look, it's a mess, and that's just the main takeaway from all of this. There are no smoothly running, fully functioning financial systems in the world anymore. Well, everybody is a mess in one way or another.
Right. Well, what about the U.S., where you have 50 states where you more or less speak a common language, and they can't agree on everything smoothly? What do you do when you have cultures and countries and languages that have hated each other for hundreds, if not thousands of years? How do you get them to all get along and be on the same page?
Well, I totally get the impulse for European integration, because you look at the past 100 years, nightmare on the continent.
A war every 20 years.
Yeah, and increasingly destructive wars. I mean, World War II was the nastiest thing that has ever happened to the human race. And World War I was the nastiest thing that had ever happened before World War II came along, and it was going in the wrong direction for these guys. So, from their point of view, a bureaucratic nanny state kind of sort of run by Germany that keeps everybody in line is a far superior to what Europe was like before that. So I get it. I get why they want to do it. It's just not easy to do. And in the context of this global financial bubble, see, Europe is a mess now. And so is the U.S., by the way. We're very messy right now. But that's in pretty good times. We've had a 10-year expansion where every year there have been more jobs for people than the year before, and house prices were up, and interest rates were down so you could buy cars. And so it's actually not a bad time for a lot of people. Now, and we're still messy. We're still having these huge political battles and weird financial things happen. But what happens in the next recession when people are thrown out of work and the price of your stock portfolio plunges and your house goes down below your mortgage and maybe you're going to lose your house because you're losing your job? That's the kind of thing that is almost inconceivably stressful. Coming after a stretch that was already pretty stressful. We've already behaved as if we were really unhappy. And we've already got political turmoil. So what kind of a political and economic system are we going to have at the depth of the next recession? I think it's going to be really, really messy. And the whole populist movement thing obviously will expand. The impulse, as you said, to look abroad for enemies, to distract your people from your own government's mismanagement, is going to be more and more tempting. So the world 5 years from now could be vastly scarier than today's world is, as scary as today's world is, Again, it comes back to the fact that we can't stop this from happening. There's nothing an individual can do to calm things down because there's so much institutional momentum. Everybody's borrowing too much money, and there's nothing you can do to stop your government from running monstrous deficits. There's nothing you can do to stop the corporate sector in your country from borrowing too much just to buy back their stock like it is. There's nothing you can do to stop people from borrowing too much for college. None of it.
Well, you can't stop them from buying stocks back if you make it illegal like it was, I think, before 1972.
Yeah, but that's not going to happen. We can't make that happen because it's in the interest of the corporations and the big banks that it continue.
John, what do you make of the fact that after the APEC summit, there was no final communique the first time that's ever happened? Why would that be? The U.S.-China trade war?
Yeah, because we're not getting along. We don't agree with anything right now, the U.S. and China. Although, I still think this is mostly just, it's a negotiation where everybody postures and they make it seem like they're willing to walk away from the table, but of course they can't walk away from the table. And they can't let this go on because the global economy is really starting to sputter right now, in part because trade is contracting, in part because we've got these trade battles going on. So there will come a time in the not too distant future when things look so scary out there that they're going to need to get stuff off their plate. And the U.S. and China will cut a deal, and it won't be a great deal for anybody, but it'll have some stuff that both sides can point to and say, look, we got this concession. I did it for you, Good thing you elected me, or good thing you keep me as your dictator, if it's China. And that'll be over. The U.S.-China trade war will just not be there anymore. But the other stuff will still be there. So, if it distracts us, right now the trade war kind of distracts us from some of the other problems. And you take that out of the way and allow us to focus on the other problems, maybe that's actually worse. Maybe we'll be more scared if we turn our attention from the U.S. and China to the amount of debt that we're taking on, or the credit default swap changes for, General Electric in the U.S. it might be relegated to junk pretty soon, and that might cause them to default on their bonds. Stuff like that. That's those are really scary things. Or tech stocks are crashing. There are air pockets under a lot of these big tech stocks that are in all the hedge funds and all the pension funds, and so when they fall, everybody else feels the pain. We're not really paying that much attention to that, but take the U.S. and China trade war out of the equation, and maybe people pay more attention to this other stuff, and they get justifiably terrified. So that might end up being something that spurs a financial crisis counterintuitively. You think it would make people happier to get the trade war over with, but maybe it just makes us see clearly for the first time how bad everything else is.
John, thank you so much for chatting with us.
Sure thing, Jim.
My guest has been John Rubino, author of several books on the economy, including The Money Bubble, his website, dollarcollapse.com. If you have any questions for John or any of our other guests, you can send them to info@howstreet.com. Find us on Twitter @HowStreet, and we're on YouTube on Talk Digital Network. I'm Jim Goddard. Thanks for listening.
Comments made on HowStreet.com radio are an expression of opinion only and should not be construed in any matter whatsoever as recommendations to buy or sell any financial instrument at any time. Available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. HowStreet.com radio is a production of HowStreet Media Incorporated.